This is a huge passage in Hebrews 11, a passage about faith. And then it ends talking about us being surrounded by such a great group or cloud of witnesses. Years ago, Joy and I were trying to get used to the Brazilian culture. And one of the things that it was a great honor to be called as a witness at a wedding. So if you were a witness, one of the ones that would sign one of the documents, you actually had always two documents because you got married at the town hall. And sometimes only 3 or 4 or 5 people would go down to the town hall. And so you would take, the couple would go and at least take their witnesses who would sign the register with them. And then they would go to the church where they had the church wedding. And during the ceremony they would stop and sign the church wedding certificate, and we'd have witnesses. And Joy and I were invited by a couple that were students of ours to be witnesses at their wedding. And of course, what we had finally learned was that as you are a witness at a wedding, you have to give a better present. So we dug deep and gave a better present. I can't remember what we gave, but we got to the church, and it was a church about this size, and there was a section corded off. I figured that was for family. And we sort of stood around waiting for instructions. They don't practice weddings in Brazil, so they just sort of happen. And there were a lot of people milling around, and finally they announced that all the witnesses could be seated. I think there were 28 or 30 or 32 of us instead of 2. So I stood up and announced to them, I said, "Oh, you great cloud of witnesses." Well, that's what we were. We were a cloud of witnesses. Whole group. But stop and think, what is it called here? A great cloud of witnesses. This is not an earthly honor, it's not an earthly view of life. This is at the end of life, or during the course of your life. It says you and I are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses. This comes right after Hebrews 11. Now Hebrews 11, stop and think, we had quite a bit of hype and news, and it was fun news to watch not too long ago. In fact, it was at Pro Football Hall of Fame. And of course, we had somebody from the Vikings finally make it into the Pro Football Hall of Fame again. Who was that? Chris Carter. That was a fun event. It was fun to have him tell his story, his ups and his downs, giving praise to God and thanks to many, many friends. And then came this very emotional moment of unveiling his bust and of being entered into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Big deal. It is a big deal, especially big in the United States of America. A lot of kids that play ball dream about one day having any kind of recognition, much less this kind of recognition. This is the Hall of Fame. And all of the football players that are honored there are worthy of that honor. And they're remembered. And they're remembered in ways that we hope that will be remembered for years. Well, what we have read here is Faith's Hall of Fame. That's Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 is a very special list. It's not a complete list, but it is a list of who God holds near sacrificing Isaac. In fact, his willingness to sacrifice his only son, to obey God and to follow God. God did not let that happen. But it was, for Abraham, perhaps one of the greatest steps of faith that he ever had. He goes on to list other great heroes of faith. Now, these are ones that get into the Football Hall of Fame. You have to be voted by other coaches and teammates. And in the Faith Hall of Fame, you get voted in by God. And he gives us a list that, it's a partial list, but that Carolyn read. Gideon, Barak, Jephthah, David, Samson. Now it's interesting, these were people who led less than perfect lives. If you think that Christianity really is all about God keeping the accounts and trying to see whether we live everything and do everything perfectly, it's not about that. In fact, we can see it from the reading that Carolyn did. These were not people who lived absolutely perfect lives, but they followed God and they trusted, they believed, and they acted on that. They lived in that way. And the whole idea of the Old Testament is not only that you believe the right thing, but that you follow and that you do it, that you throw your passion in behind that right thing. So if God, these people believed in God, that was faith. Faith also had action. Faith was not just what I believed in my head. It's very, very different. Now, the Gallup poll often asks people in the United States about their faith. And the majority of people say, I believe in God. That means up here, there's a notion that yes, God exists. There's a notion that yes, God is a reality of some sort. And there would be a whole list of different beliefs that people have, but that God is. The Hebrew understanding of faith wasn't just that you believed up here that God existed. It's that you believed it and you followed with all of your life. And these heroes of faith that are listed were not people that had perfect lives. They were not people that had an A+ stellar existence in every one of their actions. But they were people who believed, genuinely trusted in God, and threw their life into that trust. So, here at the end of this passage, he's talked about faith, and he's listed people of faith. He's listed what some of those people went through to follow through on their faith. And he says, therefore, because of faith, therefore this. Because we believe, because we are following after God. It says, therefore, because of that, and since we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. Now, that wasn't like 30-some people stuck in a corner of the church. But he's talking about you and me being surrounded at this moment by a great cloud of witnesses. How does that strike you? How does that strike you? Well, I can remember as a kid often feeling criticized. Somebody was looking over my shoulder. And I've had a number of students through the years that when they think of somebody looking over their shoulder, they shudder. Because many of us, when we think of having our screwed things up and messed up our lives, and they're going to give it to us. But truly, when he says, the writer of the Hebrews says, we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, it's a whole different thing. Have you ever watched a Little League game? And from that dugout, you got these kids craning their necks to see, is Dad here? Is Mom here? Is my big brother here? Did Grandma get here? Is Grandpa here? They might not always show it, but oh, they love to know that they've got supporters up in the stands, cheering for them, rooting for them, loving them. Yesterday we had a treat at the Pastor's Appreciation of Ben Utak. Ben Utak spoke to the group, and his dad is a Methodist pastor in our conference. Ben was in the Super Bowl. In fact, was wearing the Super Bowl ring. His hand was sort of weighted down that way. And he was in the Super Bowl playing for Cincinnati, sitting on the bench most of the time, but sitting on the bench with Tony Dungy. And he talked about what it was like to run out on the field for that Super Bowl. Can you imagine coming out of the tunnel for the Super Bowl, and all of a sudden he hears some screaming voice, a familiar voice, an embarrassing voice, and he turns around and his dad has fought the crowd. His seats were way, way far away, but fought the crowd to be down there as far as he could go, near where the players were running out of the tunnel, screaming like crazy for Ben. And Ben had the presence to turn around and look at his dad, and he said, "This all started with you. I love you, Dad." So it was a different game, knowing his dad was in the crowd. And friends, it says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by a crowd of witnesses, many, many witnesses, cheering us on, loving us, caring about us." He said, and then he uses these words of a Roman athlete. He said, since we have this cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely. Let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us. The first marathon is the end of a battle. And as that runner went to tell the king the results of the battle, after a while the armor began to weigh him down. And he pulled off piece by piece the armor and flung it aside. That was understood. When a runner in Grecian times and Roman times would run a race, they would run unencumbered. You know, I stopped to think of, for example, bicycling. I can remember bicycling as a kid. I had an old Spirit Flyer. Seemed like the tires were about that wide. The bike weighed so much I could barely drag it up a flight of stairs if I had to. I had on baggy chinos and a baseball cap that always stuck out. Now, when they talk about racing, it's a whole different story. Everything goes into making yourself less wind resistant, lighter, stronger, greater results from the effort that you make. And here you've got a cyclist in a race, and they've got modified tires, so it will grip the road and not have as much wind resistance. He's got a helmet on that's going to, not going to be like my old baseball cap. It was caught the wind. He's got clothes on that cling to him like skin. Everything, the metal the bike is made out of, everything works together to make him streamlined, to get to the finish line. This is what the writer of the Hebrews was talking about. He said, therefore, because of our faith, because that we are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses, throw off everything that is going to hold you back. And race to the finish. One of those things, he says, is the sin that clings so closely to you, to me, to each one of us. Sins that keep us from victory and keep us from our joy in God. What is it that we need to throw aside, either as sin or maybe things in our lives that do not help us onto God? Good to ask. What's holding you back? What's holding me back in my pursuit of God and my pursuit of living this life? You know, as we've heard today, in prayer, the deaths of people in our community. Someday, folks, they're going to be saying the same things about you and about me. Oh, I read in the paper that guess who passed away? And my name is going to come up, or your name is going to come up, one of these days. What is it that is holding you back from passing that finish line with a smile on your face? Knowing that you have lived this life, and the people that the writer of the Hebrews had listed were not people who lived easy lives. They were not people who just breezed across the finish line. Some of them had been held prisoners. Some of them were sick and ill, and yet pursued God. Some of them had great difficulties. I'm sure as David had great depression in periods of his life, he pursued God and finished crossing the line. People who were caught up in sin, people who were caught up in duplicitous lifestyles. The question is, what is it that holds you back from one day crossing that line with a smile on your face, knowing that you have pursued God in this life? Interesting, when you're on a bike like that, all you're doing is you're looking forward to the finish. You're looking forward to that next hill. You're looking forward to that next mark. You're not looking sideways. See, this hat does not help you look sideways and judge others or judge yourself by others. In fact, if you did that, you'd start slowing yourself down. It's all meant to look forward and to finish the race and to cross the line. The writer of the Hebrews asks us, therefore, since we are surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside everything, like those runners of old, like this cyclist. Let us lay aside everything that holds us back. Every weight, every sin that clings so closely. Let us run with perseverance. You know, there are times in a race where a runner or a cyclist wants to just pull over to the side and give up. But he said, since there's a crowd of witnesses cheering us on, people we love, it draws us back into the race. It gives us that perseverance. Looking unto Jesus, the one who's in front of us. Looking to Jesus, our pioneer and perfecter, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross. Friends, that is the task that is before us today. To live a life, not regretting and not held back. No matter how many times in life we have been fatigued and ready to drop, somebody's cheering us on, calling us to more. That we would finish this race, this life, with a smile on our face and being able to say, like Ben did, it started with somebody else. I love it. Amen. Join me in hymn 706, Soon and Very Soon.